A very warm welcome to the Thornton Bharat Chief Audit Executive Conclave. This is the first in the series that we are holding, and it's a pleasure to host all of you. I'm Saket Mehra, partner with the risk practice, and I have with me Sameer Paranjpe, partner and leader forensic services at Thornton Bharat. Both Sameer and I are delighted to host you over the next 90 odd minutes to deliberate upon this important aspect of how internal controls and internal audit play a very significant role in managing the fraud risk. And in order to do so, we have with us eminent panelists who have varied amount of experience from different industries who would be sharing their wisdom, their knowledge, their insights on this important aspect. We'll be introducing these panelists very shortly to all of you.
Thanks, Saket, and a very warm welcome everyone to this CAE Internal Audit Conclave. A very fascinating topic, as Saket said, in which we'll essentially look at how can internal controls combat fraud risk. Before I get into that, I will just introduce my fellow panelists from Grant Thornton. We have Dinesh Anand, National Managing Partner Risk, who has been a seasoned risk professional for the last 25 plus years, and out of 15 years of which he has primarily spent as a forensics leader in different firms across the industry. I also with me have my colleague Nitin Talwar, who started his career in the telecom practice. He's a telecom specialist, but has been a seasoned forensic professional for the last 12 plus years. So Saket, given where you're sitting as an internal auditor and advisor to multiple companies, and given the fact that when you sort of do internal audit, you are supposed to look at the whole basket of risk. How do you sort of manage to keep a balance between looking at the overall risk umbrella and then looking at it from a fraud risk perspective?
Well, Sameer, if I look at, I would say if I remember, over the last 20 years of my experience as a professional internal auditor, there have been certain instances where, there have been frauds, there have been, siphoning of funds, there have been misappropriation of assets at our clients. Where we have been the auditors. And it's been really tough to kind of face the question which I'm sure some of us attending this event would have faced from the management and also from the board as to what you guys were doing as auditors. And it's very typical for the board or for the management to ask that question from the auditors, and it becomes more awkward when you typically have performed an audit of a function where the fraud gets discovered. And that leads to a situation, I would say, of some kind of a trust deficit which gets created about the audit function. And in my experience, that could only be mitigated if we as internal auditors would start not being so defensive, but start being more proactive in terms of what can be changed and how it can be changed. I think few things which come to my mind, Sameer, frankly, is one is to engage more with the boards and the management. When it comes to really creating some kind of a fraud-proof environment for the organizations. And that's where I think the auditors have to work back with the management, with experts like you, to really create or to really instill that level of confidence amongst the management and the boards that yes, there are adequate amount of controls, anti-fraud controls, which have been also built up. Second is more importantly, I would say, as an auditor, to really focus on how effectively those anti-fraud controls are functioning, and maybe extending the audits to an area something like culture. Really looking at the culture of the organization, and that means you as an auditor are actually looking at how the behavioral aspects of the individuals get aligned to the value systems of the organizations. So I think what we have seen over the years is that maybe the auditors need to extend the way they have been auditing, the way they've been looking at the internal controls, and more focusing on the anti-fraud controls in the organization. That's what my take would be, Sameer. But interestingly, it would be good to hear from you as well, Sameer, because you have been looking at the things slightly from by wearing a different hat as a forensic auditor. So how do you see that the internal auditors and the forensic experts can collaborate much better?
Sure. No, Saket, very, very valid points, and probably extremely topical in the whole aftermath of the massive debate that is going on around the role of auditors, and not just internal auditors, stat auditors. And we hear that all the time, right? So when we get called in for any fraud investigation, we are saying, you know what, we had a statutory audit team and we had an internal audit team, which really is not the point that we are talking about. But purely from what you're saying is essentially, I tell my clients, if I had to express the potential or probability of fraud as a mathematical formula, it would be as follows. Fraud, the probability of fraud happening is opportunity into intent. Intent is something that nobody on this planet except the Almighty can control. What all of us in the risk management profession can do and should do is reduce the opportunity that is available to fraudsters. All our efforts as in the fraud fighting space is to sort of reduce this opportunity to the minimum possible extent. It can never be zero, but to reduce this to the minimum possible extent. Now, as you rightly said, how can sort of forensic teams work with internal audit teams to work on reducing the opportunity size? I think there are sort of multiple ways, right? The first and foremost, what we typically do, and where we have sort of done that with you and your teams on multiple clients, is sort of carry out as a part of the overall internal audit formula what is called as fraud risk assessment exercises, whereby though you look at it from a risk perspective, we purely look at it from a forensic perspective. So for example, if there is a process, let's take example procurement, most said to be universally considered to be most prone to fraud. So what we'll tend to do is you will probably look at the process perspective. I will look at what are the vulnerabilities in that process. And the way I do it is by stress testing the process. So if the company's policy says that thou shall not order anything from any customer without there being three codes, I will essentially stress test that process to see if one of my, I will essentially, me and my teams will work on putting together a vendor and trying to see if we can get through the system to get ourselves registered as a vendor. So when you sort of look at the process gaps, you identify vulnerabilities in terms of how they can be sort of taken forward. So that is I think a clear-cut area in which the forensic teams and internal audit teams can.
So what you're saying, Samir, that there is a lot where typically the internal audit teams and the forensic experts can converge. You know, the auditors would really highlight the so-called red flags, and that's where experts like you can come in and can really look at more incisively as to what really went wrong.
Absolutely. And Saket, as you rightly said at the beginning, we have absolutely a power packed panel to be able to sort of delve into those topics. And the best part, and I'm extremely excited to just talk to and listen to what the panel has to say. Given the fact that they cover such a vast, different industries from logistics to FMCG to manufacturing. So I'm really looking forward to it. And on that count, I would like to bring in my colleague, Nitin Talwar, to sort of just introduce the panelists, and then we can straightway dive into the panel. Nitin, over to you.
Thanks, Amir, and thanks, Saket. And good afternoon, everyone. Firstly, I would like to say thank you so much for investing your time with us on this discussion. Today, we have an amazing panel on combating fraud risk through effective internal controls, where our panelists shall share their experience and views to develop robust control mechanism for combating fraud through effective controls that could directly impact your business. So we are really honored to have 5 distinguished panel people for our panel discussion. I will introduce them one by one and we'll talk about a bit of their experience. So our first panelist is, we have Mr. Sandeep Datta. Mr. Sandeep Datta is working with ITC from a long time, for a long 30 years. He has worked on various positions spanning internal audit, corporate taxation, financial control in various factories. Lastly, he has worked as the CFO of ITH Limited. It's an associate company of ITC Limited listed on BSE. He has also worked as a head of finance of ITC's Hotel division. A very warm welcome to Sandeep.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Sandeep. Our second panelist is Mr. Savio Mendonça. Savio is also a very seasoned internal audit and finance professional with having more than 23 years experience in IT, manufacturing, and the logistic industry. Savio is currently working with Blue Dart as a vice president internal audit. Prior to this, he has worked on a senior position at Capgemini and iGet. Savio is also a frequent speaker at IIA Mumbai chapter, ICAI, and other various professional forums. Thanks for joining us, Savio. A warm welcome to you also.
Thanks, Nathan.
Thank you, Savio. Our third panelist is Mr. Sohrab Prakash. Sohrab is also an assurance leader and seasoned professional with global experience in internal audit, risk management, forensics, and business partnering, having worked across continents with global and Indian MNCs and the Big Four firms. Sohrab is an experienced, seasoned internal audit and risk management professional. He is currently heading internal audit and fraud control with Hero MotoCorp. Very warm welcome to Sohrab. You. Thank you, Saurabh. We have our fourth panelist, Ms. Seema Basi. Seema has extensively worked in diverse industries across the globe for over 20 years. She worked in management consulting and risk and assurance, focusing on process reengineering, enterprise risk management, risk and internal controls. She is currently head of risk and assurance at Pernod Ricard, India, managing India and Southeast Asia. Before joining, she has also worked with companies like Telecom, Vodafone. She has worked with KPMG, Deloitte, and EY. Thanks for joining us, Seema. A very warm welcome to you also.
Thank you, Nitin.
Thank you. Our fifth panelist is Mr. Neeraj Singhal. Neeraj has also over 2 decades of rich experience. He has also worked in various domains like auto component manufacturing, telecom infrastructure. He has handled varied functions relating to internal audit, SOX, assurance, and risk management. He is currently heading the internal audit and risk compliance function at JK Cement Limited. A very warm welcome to Neeraj also. Thank you. So our goal today is that whatever your role is in this industry, that you will come away with something, a new idea, a fresh perspective, a new strategy that you can apply to be more successful in your business by using the views of our experienced panelists. And then in the second half of our time, we will open up the floor to give you an opportunity to ask specific questions that you have been thinking about to help you navigate the upcoming opportunities and challenges to be more successful in your business. So with this, I would like to hand over the floor to Mr. Dinesh Anand to start the panel discussion. Over to you, Dinesh.
Thank you, Nitin. Thank you very much. And once again, a warm welcome to Sandeep, Savio, Saurabh, Seema, and Neeraj. Truly honored to have you all as our distinguished panelists for a very important topic, which we all, as you just heard, Samir and Saket talk about, right? Combating fraud through effective internal controls, and whose responsibility is it, right? Is it when fraud happens? Sorry. So when fraud happens, is it, it's always the internal auditor who will get first, who will first be hauled up for why he couldn't detect it. With that, I think my first question is to you, Savio. We've spoken about, we've been talking about whose responsibility and how do you make it effective, right? So in your experience, has the fraud risk assessment been able to proactively identify and mitigate the company's vulnerability to internal and external fraud? So would love to understand, what's been your experience around that, or have you relied more on, making sure your internal controls are operating, and, so it'd be great to get your concept on that.
Sure, Dinesh. So I think the fraud risk assessment has definitely helped in identifying, and mitigating gaps, and identifying gaps primarily in the for internal as well as external frauds, and that is what we have experienced during the course of my executions of fraud risk assessment. Primarily, if you see the ACFE's report, which talks about 43% of frauds are detected through tips actually, and the balance 57% is detected through internal audits, management reviews, as well as document examinations. So primarily, the bucket of fraud risk assessment actually falls into this 57%. I believe that fraud risk assessment cannot be in isolation. It needs to really be integrated with the existing systems that we have in place. If it's a new company, like a startup, I understand it should be a first-time exercise wherein you actually sit down and look at all your controls, be it not only for fraud, but overall your internal controls, and out of that you identify anti-fraud controls. But if it's a matured organization, already a listed company, professionally run company, you would always already have something in place, right? It could be SOX, it could be a IFC controls, it could be a risk control matrix. So what is important is that fraud risk assessment cannot be a one-time activity once a year, 6 months. It's an ongoing activity which you actually look at your internal audits, you look at events happening during a daily basis, and come back to the drawing board to look at those controls, to look at what went wrong, and then accordingly either add to the scenarios that would happen and then modify those controls. Now, just to give an example, so when phishing attacks happened, were happening rampantly during a period of time, there was already a control existing saying that, okay, for typically phishing attacks, talking about, hacking vendor emails, sending emails saying that, okay, the bank account needs to be changed. So we already had a control of a maker checker, wherein it says that, yes, you'll have a maker, you'll have a checker. But we believe that an additional control of, actually calling up the vendor on the registered mobile would really facilitate and help and as an additional control. So that was kind of, reviewed at the time when these events were happening. So it's all event based that you go back to the drawing board and check. So secondly, as we talked about procurement area, so when again we were reviewing the procurement, we already had a bidding process saying that, yes, you have 3 quotes, you look at the L1s, etc. But how are the quotes really received? If the quotes are received only by the procurement team, then again, the whole purpose of receiving the quotes and, talking about no conflict of interest would not really exist. So therefore, for certain values and above, what was introduced was a sealed bidding process wherein the bids would actually go to an independent party like the finance function during the pre-pandemic scenario. In the post-pandemic scenario, we said, fine, the physical movements of documents would be difficult. So can we have the quotes sent via email to an independent function, two independent functions like the audit and the finance, and thereby ensure that there is an independence and no conflict of interest. Secondly, there was another example wherein we had in the IT scenario when I was working, we had timesheets being entered by consultants, right? 1 lakh people entering timesheets and sent to the customers. At that point of time, they would also enter the leave information saying that, yes, they were on leave on a particular date. But in their own system, in our HR system, they would not really update it as leave. Either you would forget it or it would be a deliberate action. So how do we really do that? So what we did was we then made it mandatory through the system, through the IT control, to first enable the employee to actually apply for leave in the HR system and then be able to enter the same as a timesheet entry into the data for timesheets, which is to be sent to the customer, thereby making the HR system the primary system and then the timesheet based on that. So through IT, I believe that, yes, through IT, you can really have a lot of fraud related controls plugged in. And that's how we've been using the fraud risk assessment, looking at events happening and triggering, and then going back to the drawing board and modifying that. So that's how I've been doing, and we've been doing that, Danish.
No, thank you, Savio. I think 2 things which are standing out from what I'm hearing from you. One, how IT plays an extremely important role, and I think that's very important in today's environment where we are constantly seeing people being exposed to either data privacy issues or online fraud. And the second part which you mentioned, which I found very resonating, which was that it's an ongoing activity, right? It's not a one-time activity. It has to be an ongoing activity. With that, I want to move to you, Sandeep. And Sandeep, just staying with the same theme around fraud risk assessment, right? I want to understand, how has your organization, or in your experience, how have you used a fraud risk assessment to formulate a mature risk management plan? And how's that been effective, and how have you followed that through from a continuous monitoring perspective?
Okay, that's an interesting question, and I think it's become extremely pertinent in the last couple of years. And I think 3 basic reasons. One, of course, is, as Savio mentioned, the ACFE's report. 5% of revenue and nearly 1/3 of global fraud cases have really come out due to inadequate internal controls. The second thing is that why I'm seeing the last 2 years is that this global pandemic, COVID, has really made us move away from a lot of trusted laid down systems that have happened. Savio touched upon some of them. For example, used to have sealed quotations coming in. Used to go to an independent manager. You'd have to sort of bring out and maybe get e-quotations. If that's not managed properly, we found that there is a possibility of leakages happening, right? And the third, of course, is the SEBI LODR. that recently came out these are a major amendment, as we all are aware, in 5th of May, 2021. And two specific requirements are sort of glaring. One is the need to highlight information risks. And the second one is cybersecurity risks. Because these both take care of both your internal and external risks, which most organizations or all organizations are actually facing. Now, we're into multiple verticals. In fact, we're into nearly 15 different business verticals. The most mature vertical is over 100 years old. The least mature one is roughly 5 years old. Maturity of the systems, therefore, are totally different. And therefore, we really understand one thing is that your controls need to be catered to each individual business or industry. And it also has to be linked to the maturity of each business. Things that I can lay down in a 100-year-old business, I cannot lay down at a 5-year-old business. Because in a lot of cases, we're actually discovering how things are going about. Therefore, at this point, it's extremely important that you really have a mature fraud assessment that takes place. But one thing is very clear is that this has to be top-down driven. If you don't have a top management mandate that you can come in as an independent body and push through a fraud assessment, fundamentally, it may not really work out, to be very honest. And I think there are hinges on that. You don't have top management support, your operations teams will just slam things down. And at the end of the day, we need to understand one thing. A fraud assessment can't really happen in a silo. Operations teams have to be part and parcel of it. Internal audit also has to be part and parcel of it. And in our organization, what we have done is that we've split the risk management function from the internal audit function, because we believe that we needed a one step away for people to sort of who are not at all involved in the business. Okay, it all means that all the risk management teams have spent at least 20 years plus in the company in operational positions, but now they need to step away, bring in their experience to review it dispassionately. So these, I think, have really helped sort of change systems and controls right at the inception stage. Mostly it's done through various ERP systems. But despite that, we feel that there are still possible gaps. So what we do is that we identify areas with significant value at risk. One of the areas is definitely procurement, as Savio mentioned. And then what we do is that we bring in external specialists, third-party firms, who have an expertise which comes in because, you see, a firm like Grant Thornton or KPMG or PwC, they would be they work with 100, 200, 400 clients, much more than that actually, maybe thousands of clients. They come with a certain global expertise. So what happens is, we have realized that when we look at our fraud assessment, it's very insular. It's coming based on the perceptions and experience of people from inside the team. So our belief is that fraud assessment needs to be done definitely by the team, operating team, definitely by the inclusion of the internal and the risk management team, but you also need to also bring in your third-party specialists on a very selective basis. And we have found it does really help. So every year we pick up 2 to 3 areas where we get teams to come in from outside, and we found that it has given us a great degree of assurance. So this is part of a revisit, and I think it's working out pretty well.
No, thanks, Sandeep. And I think you have only resonated what what Savio was mentioning, that it has to be an ongoing activity, and how you need to, and I've come across clients a lot of times when we go and say, can we do a fraud risk assessment? They say, no, we understand our internal controls better than you do. We have everything under control, and end of the day, they look at it as a cost, not as something which can bring benefit. So I think that's something which time will change. But I want to just ask the next question, taking on what you covered, right? That COVID has changed everything, right? COVID changed the way we do business. Suddenly, for a year and a half, everybody, and even till now, a lot of companies still continue to operate where people are operating from outside offices, right? So suddenly your entire control environment needed to be revamped, right? And you also both of you spoke about the vulnerabilities from a data privacy, from online fraud, etc. And with that, I want to ask you, Saurabh, the question would be that, we keep seeing the importance and of customers saying how, raising concerns around either data privacy issues or around talking about, fraud, which is online fraud, especially if I had to look at the entire COVID period, right? How important is it, in your opinion, to have an internal controls process of fraud prevention program, which is effective and current with respect to technological and other, IT, what I would say, advances? And how can a company instill more confidence in their customers that their data is well protected? And everybody seems to be now moving towards the digital space, right? So how do we instill more confidence? How do we make sure that things are running the way they are?
And Dinesh, two things. I guess the first one is about having a foolproof is the endeavor, but nobody can achieve that fraud prevention program. What we see is that a fraud prevention program is actually integral to your internal controls. What we have done at Hero is that our RCMs and all our documents do have a fraud risk indicator, which we look at whether a process is vulnerable or not. So those two documents are actually linked to each other, and they flow. So when we do an audit, we would also look at the vulnerability of that process to fraud. So be it an HR process, be it a marketing process, be it a traditional procurement process, we would definitely look at a fraud risk indicator. The second question was about technology playing a part in instilling confidence in our customers. So we also run a separate technology program or should I say cybersecurity program, whereby we would look at vulnerabilities of our systems which are financial systems and also customer data hosting systems, where we would test those systems for vulnerabilities, both internal and external, and we would do that on a periodic basis. That gives confidence first to us, and that confidence gets transferred to our customers that information is safe, it is secure, and it is safe. So that is probably how we would treat these cyber security and also fraud risk in Hero.
And just sort of just to add on to what you mentioned. So how important are you is now, cyber is very important, right? So is cyber risk now built into your entire risk management program as a fraud risk assessment area, or is it still looked at as a separate area?
No, it is built as a fraud risk assessment area, because cyber, as you said, the pandemic has changed the ways of working. Everything is digital now. Even for a traditional brick and mortar sales company, which was selling only through dealerships, we are also now selling through online channels. So, be it sales, be it procurement, be it other business functions, everything is moving digital. So every aspect of fraud risk needs to be evaluated. For example, all our R&D, which is very, very critical for us, our new model development, that's also happening now. Because of the pandemic, people are working remotely. So everything needs to be looked at with the fraud risk lens and see where vulnerability exists in any of our systems, not only financial.
No, thank you. And I think that's something which is very important and has become one of the key focus areas. But again, going to a different theme, and that was covered by all the panelists before, that a lot of the fraud which is reported based on anonymous, or what we use the word tips, right? And on that, my next question to you, Seema, that it's very, and we also spoke about to have an effective fraud risk program, there has to be constant right messaging from the top, right? It cannot be a bottom-up approach, but needs to be a top-down approach. So in your opinion, how important is it for organizations, employees to trust that they can report either suspicious activities or on an anonymous and confidential basis without any fear of reprisal? Can you throw some, your experience and what is your organization done in order to instill more confidence that more reporting and more fraud cases, people feel more comfortable to report if they believe something is not correct?
Yeah, so actually, it's a very interesting question. And if you ask me, in my opinion, no one would like to work for an organization with compromised integrity and processes. So, one may fear the consequences of what would happen if someone reports such things to the top management. And I think Sandeep and somewhere had touched, it has to be a top down. The culture has to be such that people at the top also understands the importance of people reporting such issues at the right time and at the right level. They need to be heard. It has to be transparent and robust process, that goes without saying. In our organization, we have, of course, it is now digital. As anyone would say, everything is become digital. We also have a hotline where people can call, and we're trying to make it very, how do I say, vernacular. So we do have a system or a hotline where people can talk in different languages, which are local and native to our units, because we have spread over remote parts of India. And so we want to appreciate people coming and feeling comfortable talking about, and not get apprehensive about the language, or get stuck in not being able to articulate their findings to the management in the right sense and form. So we are trying to make them comfortable. We In our messaging, we do have very continuous engagement with our employees. That means there is regular, again, this is all done remotely nowadays. Earlier it used to be classroom sessions where you will have someone from the compliance or the risk and assurance team going and telling people about the importance of highlighting such issues. However, now the trainings are imparted remotely. We do conduct frequent communications are sent out. We also call sometimes broadcast messages, where people will be told what happens if things are not reported on time. As someone mentioned, if not highlighted, there's an opportunity sitting somewhere to be exploited. And hence, we value the timing of such issues coming out. If an organization is focused on building a culture where no one feels comfortable reporting wrongdoing, and people are trying to ignore, the problem that we feel is that once, again, within the internal organization, you will have repercussions, but it can also blow out of proportion. And nowadays, with the access to social media, it creates a huge, huge impact on the reputation of the organization. Things, if could have been managed internally, if it had been highlighted at the right time, did not need to go at that level. And the access that we all have today cannot be taken for granted if I am not able to act in a timely manner. So, and this goes without saying, the confidentiality and no repercussion on employees. Maybe some complaints were genuine, some complaints were false and exaggerated. It can definitely happen. So, needs to be addressed. That is how we've been playing this part.
So Seema, on this, I just want to ask you, and you touched upon it very briefly, but when you get a complaint which is anonymous versus a complaint which comes to you, which is confidential, which means I disclose my name, but I want you to keep confidential. Do you look at or address them in a different manner, or is it the same lens which is applied? It'll be good to get that perspective.
We do have a tool now where we call it Be Heard, where people can report anonymously, or people can decide to disclose the identity. So that way, there's a segregation at the beginning of how the reports are coming or the cases are highlighted to us. Having said that, people are also welcome to walk in and report to the Risk and Assurance Committee, audit committees, and also to the Chief Executive Officer, and so on and so forth. However, the confidentiality of people, whether anonymous or known is taken very seriously at all times. Even if someone comes to know during the case investigation, it is only with the selective set of people, and that is all that people will ever get to know. It is never disclosed. And all the information which we are keeping on tool, because now there's a whole, how do I say it? We protect data which is sitting in these tool also. So even that has to be redacted. So even if person has decided to disclose the identity, it cannot be made available for people who don't need to know. So we have to redact that information as well on the tool. So there are proper controls that have been put even on that tool. So no one should come to know if it is not need to know. Do I make sense to you?
No, it does. And I think I want to just quickly go very briefly before I come to the next question to the rest of the panelists on this, because I think this is something which is very important. So starting with you, Sandeep, how do you apply the same lens to anonymous versus confidential? And, just quickly, I would want to get a view from you as well as followed by Savio, Saurabh, and Neeraj.
Yes, I think, first of all, I was doing a scan of some major corporates and I was looking at the whistleblower policy. And what we found was that we found a fair percentage of corporates do not entertain anonymous complaints. Now, anonymity is important because not everyone is very comfortable in disclosing their identity per se. So I think the first thing that we ensured was that anonymous complaints would be entertained. That's number one. Number two is that, yes, we do ensure that the person's identity is not disclosed. And number three is what we did also ensure is that the whistleblower policy is not just restricted to employees, but it is to any of the stakeholders. So our suppliers, our customers, anyone. So I think it's pretty okay. And we did a revamp roughly a year back. And I think we've tried to keep it as open as possible and to ensure the security is there. You protect the identity of the person.
Thanks, Sandeep. Savio.
Yeah, so we have an independent, hotline availability, and yes, a person can disclose the person's name or keep it confidential. And yes, in terms of execution, from a committee perspective, I guess it's the maturity of the committee which really looks at it very independently and handles it. So I guess it's all the points that have been referred to. So we are also on similar lines.
We would treat each complaint or each issue raised on its merit, irrespective of whether it's anonymous or somebody has revealed his identity, his or her identity. So it will be merit first, and then the investigation approach would remain the same. It's only that if a person we know from whom the complaint has come, maybe the team, if he or she is okay with it, reach out and get more information. That's where it helps. But otherwise, the mechanism remains the same. And we would also, like Sandeep said, we will treat all and look at all complaints, whether it's anonymous or it is a named complaint. And our whistleblower channels are available to all our stakeholders, be it our dealers, be it suppliers, be it our vendors, employees, contractual employees. Everybody has access to those whistleblower channels. What we also do is we do ethics campaign and ethics workshops at our locations, whereby we will go and talk about what are the kind of issues which are basically dilemmas. People can discuss them in a forum, and also what is the right path to follow, and also which channel to use. That is something which we do periodically.
Thank you, Neeraj.
I think I'll agree with what Saurabh has said, that ideally it has to be extended beyond your employees. It has to be extended to the stakeholders such as your business partners, your vendors, etc. And at the same time, it should have the anonymous complaint, should also be able to file complaint. But one thing is that you should have a assessment channel to admit it as a whistleblower or discard it, because my experience is that many a times people just make grudges and they just raise frivolous complaints which are not, and nowadays you'll have to report the number of whistleblower received and how it has been discarded. So ideally, there has to be a preliminary screening committee which should admit whether it is a genuine complaint or not. And then once it is admitted, whether it is anonymous or whether it is coming from third-party stakeholder, it should be properly investigated.
No, thanks, Neeraj. And I think that's where the merit of the committee which is looking at the complaint becomes very important. Of course, the second thing is, in today's day and age, I absolutely agree. All whistleblowers should not be just limited to your employees. It needs to be to any of your business partners, including your vendors or distributors or any other third-party partner which you might have. Now, sticking with you, Neeraj, since we haven't had the chance to ask and we've been, there are several fraud prevention mechanisms which exist, right? So there are surprise audits, there's, we've already spoken about vulnerability reviews, operational audit. We just spoke about whistleblower policing, how effective should whistleblowers be. And then we, of course, spoke about the role of what the internal auditor, etc., does. Do you still think that the involvement of the strategic and operational goals of a business is so important and deep that companies are not able to pay enough attention to the basic internal controls from a monitoring procedure? Or do you think that environment has now completely changed and this is as important as your strategic and operational goals?
I think that has changed a lot. As Sandeep said, that it has to come from tone at the top, and in most of the corporates now they have realized the value of internal audit. I mean, with the all controls coming in place, with the CCMS tools, etc., coming in place, wherein you can bring value to the table. I think the team has understood, and nowadays I don't feel that operational, aligning with operational and strategical role is a challenge to internal audit. But yes, at the same time, audit also has to have an empathetical view. So that can be probably done by aligning your work with the business. So typically in our company, what we do is we try and keep last week of the month and first week of the month lean for customer interaction. I mean the auditing interaction, because they have their timelines for month close or maybe the first week of the month for MIS, etc. So we try and do the field work in the second and third week of the month and try and do the reporting piece in the last week of the month, so as to align with their this thing. And then it has to be a buy-in. The annual calendar is also being discussed at length with the auditees. So we generally take a buy-in so that it doesn't come as a hindrance to their operational and strategic. And it's always aligned.
No, that's great. That's great to know. And Neeraj, what's your view on the regulations around monitoring, vigilance, and disclosure mechanism? Do you think enough is being done, or more can be done?
See, I personally feel that whatever regulations are coming, they are majorly focusing on frauds by the company, not fraud within the company or fraud on the company. So typically, if you talk about, let's say, your LODR requirements, your Schedule 3 requirement, which has recently come, all of these are focusing on the stakeholders protection or the shareholders protection. So they are typically focusing on frauds by company. But when we talk about fraud in the company or fraud onto company, I think that's one area where still, I mean, of course, there is IFC control, but I am still to see any big corporate report wherein IFC is grossly failed. So I mean, those things are, in the letter and the spirit. I mean, I would personally feel that the company has complied the letter part of it, but not the spirit. So statutorily, I don't think it is being addressed. It's tone at the top. Again, I'm coming where Sandeep said, it's how the tone at the top in the organization that will derive the entire fraud risk management framework in the organization.
No, that's great, and I completely agree. Tone at the top is where it all starts and actually all ends. If your tone at the top or your intentions are not there from the top, everything else, no matter how much time, energy, what systems you put in place, you'll always find some shortcoming or the other. I think with that, I'd like to now hand over to my colleague Nitin. And Nitin, if you can just take on, we have I don't know, excuse me, the time frame which is left, but maybe we can just take on some questions from the audience. And if you could please direct them to the panelists.
Thanks, Dinesh. So we have received as of now 3 questions, and the first question is, can absence of DOA, delegation of authority, create fraud window, provided all the payouts are being approved by highest authority in finance? So this question, if I may take to Sandeep, and Sandeep can share his views on it.
Yeah, I don't think that integrity is a preserve of how senior you are or how much you really earn. Integrity comes from inside. It depends on the ethics that you have, maybe your upbringing, your exposure to the environment. So I think one of the strongest tools of internal controls is segregation of duties, right? To really ensure that what they call in your ERP as your maker checker or your parking posting. So it always ensures that there are at least 2 persons who sort of work together. I think almost any of the corporates out here would be very clear that if it's a check signing or if it's an e-payment, not one person can go ahead and sign the check. There will be 2 signatories. Legally speaking, you don't need to have 2 signatories. It's just that concept of having more people along the value chain to ensure that the controls are in place. I think you're really putting power in the hands of one person, irrespective of his education, irrespective of his rank. To my mind, is extremely unwise. So I think SOTs are really the answer.
Sure. So thanks, Sandeep. So we have another question, and the question is, employees hesitate to undergo training on compliance areas. How do you mandate do their panel measures like stopping increments or stopping salaries work? So maybe employees are hesitate to undergo training on compliance areas. So how can we enforce this, or should we make it mandatory? So for this, I think can I go to Seema, and Seema, can you please give your response on it? Seema, you are on mute.
Hi, thank you. I'm so sorry. Would you please repeat? I was trying to say, can you please repeat?
Yeah. So the question here is, the employees hesitate to undergo training on compliance areas. How do you mandate? Do their penalty measures like stopping increments or stopping salaries, does it work?
So if I understand you correctly, you want employees to compulsorily undergo a compliance training. They may not like to undergo compliance training.
Yes.
See, there are always ways to make sure that employees come and attend a compulsory training. But I would like to understand, why are they resisting or why are they reluctant to come for this compliance training? Is it work pressure? Is it managers not feeling the importance? Or is the tone at the top saying, okay, I don't care, you can just look away and the compliances can be taken care of? So how serious are we as an organization about the compliances? And what is the exposure if we don't meet the compliances? What happens if we educate our employees? I would doubt any of the people who are working with us in a professional organization would not come forward. You can put any kind of mandates to say, I would not give you increment. There would be a ding on your performance appraisal. Those are just I would just say you're underestimating the intelligence of people working for us, is how I will put it. If I explain them what it does to the organization if the compliances are not met on time, they will work and they will understand the importance. So that is my take.
Sure. Thanks, Seema. So we have another question, and the question is like, again, very interesting question. How to remove the employees thinking that internal auditor are not independent and specific to particular division only? Can I ask this question to Sohrab, please?
I think that can be done through reporting lines. So it's internal audit function normally reports in a solid line to the audit committee and a dotted line to a senior management of the team, which is more admin reporting. So as long as reporting lines are clear and known to all in the organization, this thing can get removed, that internal audit is not independent. So it is through reporting lines.
Sure. Okay. So we have another question. The question is, can you elaborate more on the fraud risk indicators and identification of the fraud and what could be the effective controls in it? So I would like to take this question to Samir. Samir, can you please take this question?
I was sorry, I was fiddling with my controls as usual. It happens, and when you want them to work, they don't work. Happens with Steve Jobs, so I'm actually small fry. So anyway, so your question was what are sort of fraud indicators are there? I think there can be a multiple. So the easiest answer to that is hire Graham Thornton and he will tell you what are the fraud indicators. But if you want a more, now since the question has been asked and if you want an answer, I think there are fraud indicators everywhere and I can talk on this for 2 days. But no fraud happens overnight. There are enough and more indicators that are already there. It is just that nobody bothered to look or the appropriate information was not delivered to the people who would have looked at this with fine eyes. So, and this has been a source of frustration for all fraud fighting professionals also, right? All companies across the industry more or less are sitting on sophisticated systems and they generate gigabytes of data every day and all sorts of MIS reports floating around. So invariably, any fraud will leave its mark in terms of indicators. So for example, in case of employee misconduct and the same ACFC report that I think Sandeep and Savio talks about what are the key, what is the key profile of a fraudster? Somebody who's worked in a function from between 5 to 10 years, somebody who's probably worked in finance and accounts, somebody probably never takes off even on Diwali, Christmas, he probably works through the night even on Sundays. So, you know, there are always these fraud indicators. It's just a question of how you marry that with your regular risk audit and ensure that these indicators are brought to light at the correct amount of time.
Sure. Thanks, Samir. So another question, I think we have again very interesting question. How much exit interviews are important pertain to identification of fraud? Okay, so may I pose this question to Savio?
Yeah, so I guess exit interviews are important, but what we have noticed typically across board is that while an employee is exiting, he would not really want his position to get a little difficult, you know, while he's moving out. And that's where I believe that although we you know, the process of conducting exit interviews exists, and with the objective of, you know, identifying what are the issues, if there are any problems with the employee or, you know, with the situation, can he come out and, you know, probably highlight some good, you know, some aspects which could be improved. But what has generally been noticed is that people do not do it. And that's where the difficult part is. In case of an investigation, what do we actually do is we get in touch with an kind of an ex-employee and then probably identify if there was something that he was, you know, connected with, or if there was any concerns which he would want to then post his exit, you know, identify. So that has been the experience, you know, over the years.
Sure. Okay, so we have another question on the Whistleblower channel. So the question here is how to include external stakeholders into Whistleblower channel practically as they are placed unorganized. So Neeraj, can you please take this question?
Yeah, sure. See, you already have a vendor database or customer database, so you can always percolate your whistleblower policy and extend them, the policy to them and ask them to participate. But yeah, my experience is that most of the time these are frivolous complaints. I mean, if you do not allot a contract to a particular vendor, he will raise a complaint saying that, you know, some people are collating, the procurement manager is not acting in the right spirit. So again, I mean, I'll come down to the same point that you will have to be very cautious in understanding the factual, you know, underlying position and then admitting it as a whistleblower. So there has to be a thorough screening before admitting it as a whistleblower. Otherwise, you will end up, you know, wasting your energies into getting frivolous complaint which will have no value. But yes, you can, you know, circulate your policy through the channel. You have a vendor and customer database, and you can share your policies with them and encourage them to speak up.
Sure. Thanks, Neeraj. So another question, I think, what if management allows procurement of respective function and they are procuring from a specific vendor without ensuring multiple quotations. So this is general, I think, what we have seen. If there is it's maybe one kind of fraud indicators where I think they are just favoring few of the vendors. So Sandeep, can you just throw some light on it?
See, I think for certain products or services, you may need to actually go in for a single vendor. Very funnily, though, we have had for many, many decades this 3-quote and you go for the L1. Sometimes it can be a bit on eyewash, right? It's not too difficult to really empanel dummy vendors also, or not so serious vendors. So what we do understand in certain cases that you need to go in for a single vendor. So what really happens is we ensure that whoever is proposing it, for each business, at least the head of finance of that business needs to go ahead and sign off on that, right? And he is then held accountable that he is going ahead and signing on a single vendor. And we have a very strong internal audit system. Okay, we have a 2-step because each business has their own internal audit team. And at a corporate level, we also have a fairly large, around a 70-member internal audit team, which also looks into it at the second level. So any manager that is taking it, and the structure is laid down the authority levels as to who will do what, they know that they're answerable, and we do ask questions. And in most cases, in fact, almost all cases, the answers are sort of credible. So I think you need to do that. You can't always say 3 vendors, 3 vendors. It doesn't work.
Sure. I think we have received one thumbs up.
Nitin,
yeah.
Sorry, Nitin, I'll just come in here. There is one absolutely brilliant question. I was just scrolling through the Q&A, and I'd request all of the panelists to sort of give their perspective on the question. The question is, do you believe companies have done enough to drive culture as a potent internal control to combat fraud? I'll request each of the panelists to weigh in on this. Do you believe companies have done enough to drive culture as a good internal control to combat fraud? How do you do that? How do you make a anti-fraud culture, so to speak?
My take on this is that companies definitely nowadays, I feel that companies are actually working on culture, not from the perspective of fraud only, but from the perspective of employee retention. I mean, I have seen this change over last few years that, companies are very, very, very focused on culture. And of course, this is not essentially to, have a fraud control parameter, but to retain employee and give them to make themselves as the choice of employer. So I think culturally they are working on it. And as part of that, some bit of the fraud work framework is also coming in through the top. So I think companies are actually working on it. Yeah.
Thanks, Neeraj. Seema, you want to come in next?
Yeah, actually, I think I made that statement sometime in my earlier question that not, in my opinion, people don't like to work with organizations which have compromised integrity. So going back to the same statement, if I know my company's culture is not supporting openness, if my company's culture does not make me highlight wrongdoings that I'm seeing on time, it make me compromise my personal values. And hence, I may not like to be associated with a company that has compromised my integrity and my personal choices in life. So I would not like to work. And if you see today's employees or the generation of people who are working and are employed, they take pride in where they work. It is more than, I mean, it is loyalty, of course. And I would also like to talk about where I work. So it is a moment of proud that I bring to other person. I work with Pernod. It shows, and that is the culture I take with me when I talk about my company. So it is very important for an individual to be associated with companies, organizations who are trusted and taken as respected companies in the professional world as well.
Thanks. Saurabh?
I would say that it is driven from your value system. So, for example, integrity is one of our 5 values. So it flows from there. It flows down, and it everybody. So it's just a given that these are things which are behaviors which are acceptable. These are behaviors which are not acceptable. People can raise issues. That openness which Seema mentioned. For example, we also have an anonymous communication channel, hyphen. So people can actually anonymously talk about what they're feeling. It's not only about raising issues, but about what are they seeing and what are they feeling and what do they think can be done better. So that is the culture of openness, which would then propagate across, and then give confidence to people that they can speak up when they see something which they would not resonate with.
Thanks, Saurabh. Savio?
Yeah, so I believe that culture actually is about the perception that the CEO, the managing director, and the senior management actually create. It is about because employees, stakeholders, they notice things what senior management do. Okay, so on one hand, if we talk about if there is a whistleblower and if people have been, although not sacked, but people have been ill treated. It could be people, senior management spending lavishly or, misappropriating or misusing companies' properties. Then the entire concept of perception that the employees get that, okay, probably any wrong behavior on that part also is justified. And similarly, if there is any ill treatment, then probably this is not something that we could voice our opinions, etc. So I guess the culture part, what we talk about, the value systems actually needs to be demonstrated by the senior management for the employees, for stakeholders to feel comfortable about saying that, yes, we are, something that can be respected and yes, will be appreciated through either whistleblower or whatever is the company.
Thanks, Savio. So walk the talk is what you're saying. Sandeep, last but not the least, Sandeep. Sandeep, you're on mute.
I'd just like to build up on what Savio mentioned, is that, see, I think it's very important to demonstrate your seriousness. And, you'd have various policies. Most of them would also be statutorily required, whether it's POSH or your UPSI or your corporate governance, whatever it may be. Unless you have a system of constantly communicating this across the organization, because the rank and file need to be aware of it. You can't say that POSH is just known by the senior management. No, it's each and every person. It's not just the women employees. The men employees also need to know what their boundaries are. What is the correct behavior for them? So unless this communication is happening, unless this training happens, okay, both when people are entering the system and also as a refresher at a periodic level, that culture doesn't get driven. There's no point in saying, I have a POSH policy, I've got a POSH committee, no. You just need to constantly needs to keep on happening. That's really where the culture comes
in. Sure. Thank you so much, Saket. Nitin, Saket, over to you.
Yeah. No, thanks, Amir. It's been really exciting to hear these excellent views from all the panelists. But I would just like to kind of talk about the fraud risk management framework, which initially we were deliberating upon. And I think all the panelists talked about the risk assessment program. I think Sandeep, you talked about the maturity level of an organization and how the FRM as a program also matures with organization. We also heard how technology is playing a significant role in managing and maintaining the FRM as a program. And likewise, Seema talked about. But one of the things which I'm surprised with, frankly, is one of the poll questions which we had, where we wanted to understand from the audience that who exactly the risk management or the fraud risk management as a framework in the organization. And surprisingly, almost 40%, 39 to 40% of the respondents said the CFOs. It's a CFO office which actually is responsible to manage the FRM. And it's only 21% of the respondents that it's the responsibility of the chief risk officer to kind of manage the FRM as a organization. And it goes back that we were deliberating just before I came in as to it's also about, so how in your experience, in your companies, in your experience, this perception can change, that it's not only the finance function's responsibility, it's not only the office responsibility to manage or to maintain the FRM, it's a wider responsibility which entails with each and every person in the organization. What's been your experience? What is that your organization has been doing to change this perception? Maybe we can start with Seema. And
Okay. So you rightly said that, Sakib, that it is a responsibility of each and every person of the organization. So though you can have a custodian of who manages the risk or the risk register and what is identified, but unless it is gone down to the every employee who's participating in day-to-day operations of managing this organization, unless he or she feels it and delivers it, you can only have it on a paper. It has to be culturally driven. It has to be part of your DNA, as cliche it may sound, but that's where I say.
Great, great. Saurabh, what's your views?
No, I resonate with what Seema is saying. Normally, the question is what people tend to, understand is that whoever maintains those registers are responsible for it. So there's a distinction between who is the custodian and who's actually responsible for these controls. So I concur that it has to be, bottoms up and top down, both. Everybody needs to own their risks. Everybody needs to own their controls, and only then can this be embedded in the organization.
Sure, Savio.
So I fortunately worked in organizations which were matured in terms of understanding the risk and internal controls is the responsibility of each and every function and stakeholders. So this problem per se has never existed, and it kind of evolved, and there was a learning curve for that, to get all people on board, and especially the function. But again, it comes back to the tone from the top. What does the management overall believes? That is it just a tick the box approach of managing some kind of compliance and closing it, or do we really believe that this is going to be helpful for the organization? So I guess again the tone from the top and maturity of the organizations.
Sure, Sandeep, you want to go next?
Okay, as I said, we've got 15 different business verticals. Now the responsibility for risk management, or even fraud risk management or financial controls normally remains the management committee, which is headed by a division chief executive and has got finance, HR, and stuff like that. Going to the next level, the risk library, each risk, you've got a risk custodian. So it's an HR related risk, you've got the HR head. But the coordinator of the risk management for each business, which we call a divisional risk officer, the DRO, out of the 15 business, 14 of the businesses, the DROs all finance people. Right. And despite having this structure, though I might be holding a certain person responsible, willy-nilly, everyone tends to be turning and looking at the finance person. So whereas if you ask me in the structure, I can tell you, yes, it's broad-based, it's operations, it's the general management who takes care of it. But let me tell you, at the end of the day, somehow the finance guys are carrying the torch. Now, it's something that we are desperately trying to change. But I think it still remains with finance. But I think we fundamentally understand that is not right. It's not the sole preserve of finance. But I think maybe due to inclination or training, people believe it should be finance. So I think that's how it's going.
That's very true, because Sandeep, even as professional internal auditors, we also face that as a challenge, that typically internal audit is the responsibility of the finance function. I mean, they are the people who need to get the audits done.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So I think that's the perception which has to undergo a change. It's changing, but it's changing at a slow pace, maybe.
Yes, absolutely.
What are your views, Neeraj? What do you think? I mean, how this perception can change or has changed in your organization?
So we are again trying to change it. So one way which we have adopted is trying to involve more people than only the HOD. So typically, when we discuss the risk register earlier in my experiences, I have seen that we used to finalize the risk register or risk control matrices, discussing with only the top few people. But now we try to involve as many people as we can. So when we are working on, let's say, risk register for a particular area, operations, HR. So we do not only discuss with the HR head, but we try and involve the multiple person from the HR to put their views, discuss, and understand that they are the risk owners to this. And every 6 months we take a confirmation from them. Similarly, when we take up any audit, we try and do an initial briefing session with not only the location head or unit head or function head, but try and involve a large population to give them a briefing of what we are trying to do, what is our scope and how we are working on it, what is the compliance requirement and how everybody is responsible. So overall trying to create a culture across the organization for owning the things. So typically that's how we are trying to do it.
Sure. I think the other thing which came out from the poll, which we just took from the audience, was about the periodicity of undertaking a fraud risk assessment. And as we heard from most of the panelists, that yes, it's it has to be done something at a much more frequent basis. It is something which is, because the risks are dynamic, so we need to assess and we need to identify the fraud risk at a much more frequent intervals rather than kind of taking it semi-annually or maybe annually. What came out in the poll, which we just concluded, that 31% of the respondents said that yes, this kind of an exercise is being done on an annualized basis, which also means that we as organizations, we as kind of risk professionals are yet to accommodate the true sense as to how relevant a fraud risk assessment is. But let's hear from you as to, in your organizations, how often do you undertake this kind of an activity? I think some of you have already talked about that it's being done on a much more frequent basis, but let's hear it as to what are the different things you are doing to make it much more real time, to make it much more interactive by engaging more number of stakeholders, so that the perception gets changed from an annual activity to a much more frequent activity. Maybe Savio, you want to start first?
Yeah, Saket. So as I said, it's an ongoing process, and we don't really we keep going back to the drawing board with each of our internal audits for each of events that have happened, and we kind of update the risk controls and bring in further controls to mitigate. So I had given examples right from procurement to the phishing attacks and all that. So that's how we primarily go about even the previous organization and current.
So you're not doing it on an annualized basis. This is on a regular basis.
On a regular basis. So we don't per se conduct. So we conduct the business risk assessment on an annual basis, and from there also it flows. Some of the fraud risk element flows into it. Like for example, cybersecurities we spoke about, right? So if our cybersecurities are not tight enough, you could have a situation of a hacking and data leakage, etc. So that's how. So that happens on an annual basis with a 6-month update, quarterly updates. But the fraud risk assessment is an ongoing activity.
Okay. Sure. Saurabh, if I can come on, asking you the same question, and one more thing which came out in the poll was when it comes to assessment of the third-party risk, only 49% of the respondents believe that yes, they don't conduct a third-party risk assessment. Now, looking at the business in which you are, looking at the diversified operations your organization is into, what's your take on this? I mean, is it okay to have not done that third-party risk assessment?
No, I would think we should do a third-party risk assessment. So what we would do is for our both on the sales side and the procurement side, we would do third-party risk assessments for both. We would look at even if we are appointing a new dealer, we would get a risk assessment done, because ultimately the dealer will determine how our market performs wherever he's operating. Similarly, on the supply side, so it's not only financial risks attached to it, but operational also. What if the supplier is unable to deliver, or he has other business interests? What do we do then? Ultimately, our production will get hampered, and that will lead to our production and sales loss. So both sides is something which one should get done.
Seema, what about in your case? Again, diversified operations, you have bottling plants all across. So how important is a third-party risk assessment for you?
Actually, it's very important because my business continuity and the reputation both are dependent on this. So if the bottler is not complying as required by all the conditions, because it's a highly regulated industry for us, I cannot continue. And any one thing gets leaked out, then my reputation is gone. You will only read headlines of one bottle found somewhere or someone doing counterfeiting, and they do not get into the detail. They just put the brand out there. So this is one of the biggest risks that we monitor, and we work on that.
Sure. And I think, Sandeep, the same goes for you, looking at the complexities involved in your business, the diversified nature of the business verticals in which you are?
No, absolutely. I think onboarding as a supplier into ITC is a hell of a job. It's very, very difficult to get into as a vendor. And reason being is because we do various types of reviews before vendors onboard. So first of all is the financial review. But then we also are very concerned about our image. Like we don't want any of our vendors to be, let's say, using child labor, not paying the minimum wages, not complying with this thing, pollution control norms. It's important from both image and also from continuity of business, both of these. But I think in the last couple of years, I think it's become even more imperative because of the ESG related issues. Because I think even I'm coming back again to the SEBI LODR of May 21, because it's a totally a game changer for Indian industry. I'm not too sure how much people are really talking about this, but now that you have to take in ESG or sustainability related risks into your risk management framework, when you're looking at ESG, you have to include your third party. It is not enough to just restrict yourselves to your So in the training workshops that we are taking, traditionally we've looked at what does a good procurement manager do? So fundamentally, we say there are three things that a good procurement manager traditionally had to do. He had to ensure that the supplier gave a good price, was able to give consistent quality, and the third one, consistent quality, low prices, and assured supply. If these three factors were there, you were a great procurement manager. It is not so anymore. It is much, much more. So I think third parties doing these checks are going to be even more important, extremely, extremely important, because investors are also looking at ESG today. And if you're not looking at these third party interfaces, I'm sorry, you're going to sort of fall flat, actually. That's how
I completely agree with you, Sandeep. I think the point which you made about I would say the forced labor practices, and we have seen certain businesses, and more importantly, the government businesses in countries like India, Bangladesh, and the nearby countries. They faced a lot of challenges from their customers in Europe and US and the other countries because they were adopting forced labor practices. And I think increasingly, yes, the companies, the investors, as you rightly pointed out, are very cautious about the practices which are being deployed in the remotest of the businesses, where they have invested. So it's a very important point. Neeraj, your perspective on in terms of the periodicity of conducting FRM, the importance of third-party risk, how does your organization deal with these issues?
I think third-party risk nowadays, it has assumed a greater responsibility. So, we are working with partners who are assuming greater responsibilities. Say, for example, loyalty points partner, wherein, they have got all the data and everything. So data security becomes a very important point. So it's not only getting an NDA signed off. We try and take a CES 70 report or their ITGC compliance report and the backup server which they have. So we go beyond the normal NDA, etc., and try and see what kind of security and safety measures they have at their end, because that is equally important for our business also. So I think it has taken a big role nowadays than just getting a NDA signed off with the partner and working with them.
Sure. Thank you. Back to you, Nitin. In case if there are any more questions from the audience, we can take them.
Nitin, you're on
Sorry,
mute.
Nitin, you're on mute.
Okay, yeah, sorry. So I'm saying again, there are multiple questions which have been, I think, asked for by the audience. But considering the time, I think we can take the last two questions. The first question is, what is internal audit role in situations of management override of control? So we have seen maybe some of the promoter-driven companies are there, where sometimes internal audit also maybe understand that there are issues related to management override. So how should we, I think, internal audit look into these kind of issues and maybe act accordingly? So I think I need maybe, so I can start with Sandeep. Sandeep, if you can just share your views about it.
Could you just rephrase that question again? Could you just repeat it?
Yeah. So the question here is, what is the internal audit role in situations of management override of controls? So in case of,
I think,
yeah.
No, I think the point really remains as to how independent is your internal audit. It's as simple as that.
Yes.
If internal audit doesn't have a clear line of reporting out, ideally speaking, it should be straight to the audit committee. I don't think most of corporate India does have that. They tend to report to a very senior manager in the organization. It could be the CFO or the CEO. To that extent, I won't say it's compromised, but it is not possibly as independent as it should be. Okay, so there's a slight drop down out there. But keeping that in mind, that if you do have an independent internal audit function, it's going to come up. But if it's not going to. It's as simple as that. I think if you go back as far as the Satyam case, you did have an internal audit function. It was fairly large. The fact of it was totally compromised, right? So the moment the internal audit sort of joins and sort of is hands in gloves with the management, it I think falls apart. And it's as simple as that.
Sure, great insights. So, and the last question is, so I think it's a suggestion, I would say, maybe a question. So audit team should consist of multi-functional person, so that has worked well in the experience. So what is your take, Savio, on it? Should maybe internal audit team also include members from different functions, and they should get a chance, because I think some of the operations team has better insights of the processes. So Savio, what's your views on it?
Sure, I think that also depends on the industry, Nitin. I guess when we talk about a manufacturing industry, which is typically manufacturing focused, let's say, for example, Mahindra's or tractor division or anything like that, you definitely need to have people who are engineers, people who can understand the production line, who will be able to identify concerns, looking at rejections, looking at your probably the process of machine hours, rates, understanding that, and then accordingly giving some feedback or identifying some areas for improvement. So be it pharmaceuticals, be it so IT industry, for example, again, you would need to have people who are from the software background to really understand when the reviews of operation projects are handled. So I believe that depending on the industry, you would need to have specific people from various functions, at least from the core functions, into the internal audit team to facilitate that. So yes, absolutely for that.
Sure. Even I think we have seen in the ITC also. So even I think in my interaction with Sandeep, so there
Yes.
also there is a cross-functional team. They get an opportunity to work as with the internal audit team.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah. And I think this is the last question for I think Samir, you and me. So there is a question. So everyone agrees combating fraud is a culture which needs to be driven top down. But how could newly appointed stat auditor identify fraud in the organization in his early years of appointment?
Nitin, why don't you have a stab at it?
So my view of Samir is, maybe I definitely agree, because I think prior to taking any of the stat audit, definitely there is a tone at the top. What's your views about the fraud awareness or maybe the fraud culture? Tone at the top is very important. For stat auditors also, it is very important, because once they join and they feel maybe the area of fraud is not somewhere linked to them, and they feel maybe our work is related to only to just validate the numbers or not about the other areas related to maybe fraud, what kind of internal practices they have. For the stat auditor, it is important to see what kind of fraud risk could exist. Maybe again, so there is a financial statement fraud could be a bigger issue for them, or there could be internal controls where the money has been siphoned by the senior management. Okay, so for them also, in my view, it is important to assess tone at the top, number one. Number two, check what kind of anti-fraud culture the company has. And then there are definitely specific areas about what kind of policies they have related to transacting with the related parties, what kind of policies they have for vendor onboarding, because there are 3-4 ways which are very common. By way, I think either they have diverted the money, or maybe, so there are other issues related to it. So Samir, what's your view maybe on it?
No, so I think Nitin, you covered that, but I think the question is from a stat audit perspective. So as our brethren in audit will say, finding fraud is not the stat auditor's responsibility. His main job is to ensure that the books of accounts reflect a true and fair picture. In line with that, the area from a fraud perspective that they should be most concerned with, and I think Sandeep talked about the Satyam scandal, was that whether the books of accounts reflect the true position of the company. So in terms of financial mismanagement, and we have seen examples of that, do they have a robust audit program in place to be able to catch those things? And I think Saket made those points in the opening statement, saying the increased scrutiny and accountability that is demanded from not only the regulators but the general investing public at large, from our stat auditors as well as internal auditors. Now, that's the question that I know each and every audit team out there is sort of thinking and sort of taking steps to ensure that that audit program is robust enough to meet those expectations. So with that, Nitin, I hand it over to you and Saket for the closing remarks.
Sure.
Sure. Thanks, Amir. I think I would just like to add one more point to it, Nitin, which is like, when the new set of auditors come in, it's very important for them to get into conversation with the existing internal auditors. And very often I've seen that kind of conversation does happen, but not in true sense and the way in which it should happen. And we've got experts like the head of audits in different companies. I'm not too sure if any one of you would also want to share your point of view as to when you have seen the set of new auditors coming in. What are the kind of questions they ask you as the chief audit executive for them to be aware of any kind of fraudulent activity in past? Anyone who would like to pick it up? Saurabh, Savio, Neeraj.
I'll take that on, Saket. So we had a change of auditors, I think now 3 years back.